to share my screen. I hope this is the right screen because that's the one I want. Optimize for video. Okay. So let me make sure that you all can see what I see. The video thumbnails are okay. So do you see, I just want to make sure that you see my PowerPoint because again, I have three screens.
Yes.
So, okay, so you do see it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So everyone, I'm so excited that we are here today. So far, we've had training about DEI terminology, which is important to know so that you're not making errors when you speak with other people around issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we talked about institutional racism, which the point of that is the historical components. And now we're going to talk about implicit bias and microaggressions. And ideally, with all these trainings, you're taking away insight into how you can kind of mitigate these things. So, with the terminology, just think of it as being able to use the correct terms, educate others about the correct terms. We talked about intersectionality, racism, and Islamophobia, terms like that. So you know the difference between equity and equality. So you take that away and are able to share that. Institutional racism, when you hear those conversations, which we all hear, is why can't those, whoever those people are, pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Then you can share, some of the historical as well as contemporary policies that have impeded certain groups from being able to do just that. So we looked at, the boarding schools that natives were forced into and how their culture was stripped from them. And we know now a lot of them, still have a lot of issues because they're living on reservations, which is land that you cannot grow things on. And there's a lot of culture that was lost. We also looked at the housing administration and how they implemented redlining and housing covenants. And I would hope that you understand that that's why we continue to see the inequality being reproduced in our society, because we have certain groups that are starting many, many years behind others. It wasn't until the Housing Administration Act in the 60s that redlining and housing covenants basically were taken away. But the reality is that there are still many, many investigations each day into realtors as well as renters who do not want to rent to people of color or people in the LGBTQI community or disabled people. So tonight we're going to talk about implicit bias. So we're going to define it. We'll talk about the neuroscience behind it. We'll understand how the media, history, and other factors impact it. We're going to talk about some ways to mitigate the bias because we are all human and we have them. We're going to talk about microaggressions, exactly what those are, who's subject to it, and how to address them when we see them. So if you are human, you have biases. So is that should be what you see on your screen? Are different people with the light bulb on? I just want to make sure, and recognizing that everyone, to include myself, has bias. If you're human, again, you have biases. So, along with those biases, right, that implicit bias is our judgment or behavior towards certain things and people that result from a subtle cognitive process that's developed through experiences, whether it's ones we've actually had or we've been told, via a variety of outlets. So, I often think of the media and the way they depict certain groups. We can think of our Vietnam veterans and the way they were depicted. We can think of the Hispanic population. If I base my assumption of them off the media, I would think everyone was Mexican, which is not true. That misses so much of the diversity in the community, and that they were not documented. If I looked at the media and made my assumptions of African American men, my assumption would probably be that they, possessed a lot of criminality. When we think about women and the way they're depicted in the media, oftentimes it's very hypersexualized. And these images, while we know they're not correct, I hope we all know that, they often still remain in our subconscious. And that's what impacts our biases. So you see with implicit bias, microaggressions goes right with that, as well as stereotypes. And stereotypes are those overgeneralized ideals that we have about certain groups. So that would be like, well, women should only be in the kitchen cooking, or low income people are in that position because they want to be, that they're happy with that situation. Where if you remember from our conversation with institutional racism, that's not necessarily true. There were mechanisms put in place. And then we'll go into microaggressions a little bit later on in the presentation. So I want to play this video for you. I think it is so powerful. And this was by Procter and Gamble, and it's about unconscious bias slash implicit bias.
It is the latest push to promote its diversity efforts. Procter & Gamble is shining a light on the struggles of black men in a provocative film titled The Look. It tackles the unconscious biases that black men face in their everyday lives. Procter & Gamble's new diversity ad opens up with a black man lying in bed, puzzled about life. It then follows his daily routine of walking his son to school. When his son waves at a little girl in the backseat of a car, her mother, seemingly bothered, rolls up her window. The father heads to work and is clearly ignored while walking to the elevator with a deep stare. In this scene, he's looked at in disgust while teaching his son how to float in a pool.
It's really a bold step for a major corporation to take on an issue like this.
We spoke with Jewett L. Walker Jr., president and chairman of the board of the 100 Black Men of Los Angeles, outside his home in Culver City.
Everyone needs to be aware of the implicit biases that exist in our society, and I think that this goes a long way to waking people up to what implicit bias is.
Walker has mentored young African American men for decades and now leads the organization's local chapter, who is working to educate boys and men about the biases. So we wanted to get his take on the provocative ad.
It happens all the time and more often than we care to admit. One of the things that we do with our programming is let our young people understand that these are the things that await you outside of the community that you were raised in. And you need to be aware of the consequences of not responding properly when people show you that kind of bias.
The spot, however, does have some surprising and promising twists. Perhaps the most powerful scene is when all rise inside a courtroom. The assumption that the black man is a defendant entering the room is just that. It turns out he's the judge.
Until they put on that suit or they put on that robe or they put on that doctor schmuck, when they get ready to go out to their job, you're not aware of who they are or what they do. And it's unfortunate.
And you know, that was a moment for me. I was like, please don't let him be the defendant. And then you have that surprising twist at the end. It's so important to have this conversation. Procter & Gamble, they actually sent me a statement, and it says the first step to addressing any problem is having an honest talk about it. Whether or not you've experienced it yourself or you have no clue about the culture and what black men face every day, it's still something that we should be talking about, just to make sure that everybody feels comfortable and feels welcome. And we want you to join the conversation.
So I really like that video because it's relevant and it's real. These are things that are taking place in our society every day. These are situations that a lot of people who are marginalized have to deal with on a daily basis. I've had situations where people make really bad assumptions about me based on the complexion of my skin or based on my sex or my sexuality. And oftentimes they're very overgeneralized stereotypes. But when we see things like this happen, I mean, to me, that was a phenomenal video. Other people stood there and they saw what was happening. So they were kind of passive bystanders. You know, no one said to anyone, like, why are you staring? Like, what's going on? What's running through your mind? You know, why are you like actually trying to address the issue at that point. So what is implicit bias? It's really second nature. It served us well when we were a society of like nomads, you know, hunters and gatherers, because it helps you figure out who is friend or foe. What our mind does is we want to categorize things quickly because it helps with our reaction. So it's kind of fight or flight, right? But it's those feelings outside of conscious awareness and control that are implicit. It truly is like second nature. So, with implicit bias, it's impacted again by a variety of things, such as our beliefs, which can be very stereotypical about some groups and how that affects our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So, when I look at Jacksonville, there is something called an index of dissimilarity that the US Census tracks for every city. And you can look up whatever city you're in. And so it runs from 1 to 100. And that tells you how people would have to move. So let me give you the example of Jacksonville. So in Jacksonville, out of 1 to 100, we sit at a 60. So what that means is that 30% of European Americans in Jacksonville would have to move into more diverse neighborhoods in order to make Jacksonville a truly integrated society. Or 30% of African Americans would have to move into more European American communities or neighborhoods to actually make Jacksonville integrated. So that's part of the problem with the bias, is that we're not interacting with people who do not look like us. And if you recall from one of our earlier sessions, we did that diversity profile sheet where we looked at that. And it's imperative that you think about, who are you associating with? Are you associating with people who look like you, have the same religion, same political affiliation, same social class, same sexual orientation? Or are you actually venturing out to get to know people who don't fit that mold, who do not belong, to all the same categories that you do? And again, this is because with that bias, we want to place people into certain categories. I'm not sure how many of you all remember the skit on Saturday Night Live about Pat. And the whole point of the skit was Pat was that you didn't know if Pat was a male or female. Pat was ambiguous looking, and that really bothers people. And that happens also, not only just with sexuality, but we also see that with race and ethnicity. When people are ambiguous, other people kind of feel the need to ask them, so what are you? That is never a good question. My response as a biracial woman is, I'm human. But just being cognitively aware, that like that's not really something you should ask someone. But again, when we see people who are ambiguous, whatever type of way that is, we in our mind just need to place them somewhere. So, as a matter of survival, we tend to put people, places, and things into categories quickly, which has assisted us in processing the situation, the person, or the event. So it's great, like for fight or flight. Am I in a dangerous situation? I need to be cognitive of my surroundings. It's dark. I'm a female. I need to be aware, but we also need to be aware and know how to mitigate that. And we're going to talk about that. So we have what's called a social hierarchy, which I'm sure you all know, but that affects our bias in America. The reality is that our historical memory and culture has a lot to do with our stereotypes and implicit bias, as well as our units of socialization. That's why I wanted to cover the institutional racism, that historical component with you, so you can gain an understanding of how that continues to impact our biases. So, sociologists, we acknowledge that there is a social hierarchy in America. And oftentimes in America, it's based off of social economic status or class. But there's a direct correlation to race, albeit race is not biologically real and is a social construct, but there is a direct correlation between race and class. And that's because of, as we spoke the last time, of those historical institutional policies and practices, as well as some contemporary ones that have not allowed certain groups to advance at the same level as others. So we have to, in other countries, there's hierarchy. The caste system they say is gone, but it's still there. We know in South Africa, apartheid is gone, but I've been there and the villages are still very much set up based on white, colored, or black. So different areas, the hierarchy is different, but this impacts and affects our bias. So, social stratification, as per sociologists, we understand it as a hierarchy ranking, right, within a society of various social classes. And it's typically according to wealth, power, and prestige. In America, we know that also impacts, race and ethnicity. So oftentimes when we talk about this social hierarchy, we see in America that European Americans are perceived to be on the top of that hierarchy. But in communities of color, there's even a hierarchy that is often based on color. Often in the Hispanic and African American community, perception is that if you're fair, and I think in the Asian community as well, if you're fair skin, then your opportunities are better. That you're perceived to be of a higher class, that you're perceived to be of a better uh, pedigree, if you will. So we have to acknowledge and recognize that. So we know women, right, in institutional inequality. I'm not sure if we talked about this, and that's odd that that's actually in this slide. Um, but we know that they could not, own property. That we've had three women's movements, and that they couldn't, have credit without their husband's approval. And we've seen how that has impacted, employment opportunities as well as pay, right, within our society. And when we look at homosexuality, we see the same thing, right? It used to be considered a mental health illness. The federal government had investigated employees' sexual orientation at the beginning of the Cold War. So we know this again is still in our unconscious bias, and it's functioning because it's part of the history of our society. So when we think about implicit bias, again, everyone has it, right? To include minorities, everyone who is human has bias. And it is pervasive, and we have to learn how to recognize it and how it affects our interactions, decisions, and responses. Often when I go into certain, workplaces, everyone is very homogenous. Everybody kind of looks similar. And we'll talk about the different types of bias that kind of create that. But it does influence our interactions and our attitudes towards those in the out group. And people in the out group are those that we don't identify with. They're different than we are, whether it's their social class, their race, their ethnicity, or their religion or political affiliation. But it does impact us, and we may not even be cognizant of it. So the generalizations we have are developed throughout our lives, and they cause us to have beliefs or ideals about other groups based on characteristics outside of their control, right? So you see this slide, we have here a woman, it says Muslim. We see a slide in, the woman Indian. We see someone with a sign that says criminal, another woman of Asian descent, immigrant, a white male. The assumption is he's privileged, and then queer. So these are some of the boxes that we place people in, but that in group and out group association really impacts our biases. And it's imperative that we interact with people, again, that do not fit into our groups. So there are a variety of unconscious biases that we all have. So there's one called the beauty bias, which is judging people based on how they look. So, as a woman of color, I can say that I'm glad to see what we're defining as beautiful is changing. I want to also say that the reality is the average size of an American woman is a 14, but oftentimes we have people that's not depicted necessarily in the media. But with that beauty bias, we tend to judge people based on how they look. And then we have that affinity bias, which is what I kind of alluded to when I spoke about jobs and seeing people who all looked alike. And that's like hiring people that are the same as ourselves. And I'm sure you all have been in situations where you've seen that. You're kind of like, okay, everybody's kind of like the same. There's this lack of diversity, whether it be in skilled trades, college education, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, whatever. We have the horns effect, which is that negative assumptions cloud our judgment. So when I think about instances surrounding men of color, I see a lot of negative assumptions associated with them. Well, that's rather concerning to me. I'm the mother of an 18-year-old African American male who's a freshman at Florida State. And I'll be very transparent. I have a tracker on his phone that he knows of. And it's not so much that I worry about him, I'm worried about other people, and I feel that I need to know where he is because as a male of color in America, you know, I'm concerned. And I think we've seen why, and I think it's a legitimate concern. Confirmation bias is searching for evidence to back up that first impression. So that would be like you meet someone and your initial impression is that, they're just a bad person. So you're looking, you're looking for them to do something to conform, to confirm and justify, why you've treated them this way or why you feel the way that you do about them. Attribution bias is how we perceive the actions of others. Well, did they do that with ill intent? Is that how we feel? Do we feel that they should have just complied? That's one I hear often. Why didn't they comply? But then we see other instances where other people don't comply and do things, and we don't see the same end result. So that's problematic. Then we have conformity bias, where we're changing opinions to conform with the group. So recently, we recognized the anniversary of the spacecraft Challenger. And that to me is a prime example of conformity bias. There was one engineer that kept saying before they took off during the whole process that something wasn't firing right, something wasn't firing right. And all the other engineers kept telling them, no, 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 it's okay, it's fine, believe, And basically, he gave into that peer pressure. And we all know that as soon as the Challenger went up, it exploded and all those astronauts died. So we have to be careful of that conformity bias. Halo effect, perceived as having more positive traits than others. And to me, this kind of goes with that affinity bias, though. We tend to show favor and mercy towards people who look like us versus people who are in the out group who don't look like us. So I just want you to take a moment and think about these origins of difference. So when did you first become aware of differences between the sexes? So, I have a brother. That was early on. What about race? Even though we know race is a social construct, when did you really become aware of it? How about sexuality? What about class? Most often people become aware of different classes around, I'd say, middle school, when we begin to venture out and go to other people's homes and notice some people don't have as much as we have or they have more than. And then, when did you first become aware of differences in abilities in people? I grew up, one of my neighbors who I played with often, her dad was blind. So that was pretty early for me. But just something for you to think about and to remember your own personal experiences. So again, we won't talk about this, but I'll make sure that I share this slide with you guys so that you can have those, more in-depth conversations. Or if you like, once I finish presenting, then we can have that conversation. So what are the units of socialization? In America and in sociology, we recognize that there are four. So you have family, friends, school, and the media. And if you think about Jacksonville, right, we utilize what's called the neighborhood school model. So many children today are going to schools that are more racially segregated than the schools that we attended. When I think of Jacksonville and the schools also, we are the 20th largest school district. We are the sixth largest in Florida, but we are number one, the public schools, for referring African American and Latino males to law enforcement for disciplinary reasons. I know that bias is involved with that because I know teachers do not come into the classroom with malice and ill intent. But because of these biases, we see these issues, this prison to pipeline taking place. So there are a variety of things that shape our biases, right? So these primary units of socialization, think about your family. When you grew up, did you live in a homogenous community where everybody kind of was of the same social class? Did you all kind of attend the same church, look similar, things like that? When you begin to think of your friends, right? We tend to associate, again, with people who look like us. And I want to encourage you to really venture out and get comfortable being uncomfortable and having those conversations. School, again, major unit of socialization, and even the textbooks that were offered. I was talking with someone earlier about how Pearson had to actually recall some textbooks because they depicted slaves and slavery in that that passage, that Atlantic passage, as being they referred to them as employees and as if that migration was not forced. So they actually had to recall some of the books. So I'm glad that a parent was able to catch that. And then when we think about the media and the depiction of certain groups, again, like I said, I mean, just a lot of the rhetoric that I've heard via the media. We know with COVID-19, I was concerned for my Asian brothers and sisters because it was being called xenophobia is real. And it was initially being called, a Chinese virus. And that's not acceptable and that's not okay. And we have to make those corrections when people say things like that. So I was happy to see that finally stopped. But these are all things that really impact our implicit bias. And again, it's unconscious, but the impacts can be detrimental, to certain groups, and it could be really traumatizing. So I have another video and it's really short and it's one of my favorite ones.
Massive heavy metal. In the band, I started with friends.
He's got long hair, but at work he ties it in a ponytail. Probably piercings.
I read a lot of books. I read cognitive psychology, behavioral science. I've spoken at TED Talks.
Really? Wow.
You look nerdy. Like you think you're cool, but you're still a nerd. أكثر شيء مركز عليها التراث الإماراتي واللغة العربية.
And I also think he's wearing a condor.
Yeah, even I felt that, yeah.
أنا وايد أحب الطبخ. دائما يعني معظم
Oh, sorry.
وقتي أطبخ في المطبخ. طبعا يعني في المطبخ.
He's mature, like he said, like cheddar cheese.
You mean basically معفن. Extreme sports athlete. I skydive and pretty high risk activity for sure.
Because your actions speak louder than words, right?
God, dude,
Whoa.
that's awesome.
لا هوني surprised.
It was amazing when the lights came on and you get to realize who you're actually conversing with.
واستغربت اول شيء لان اول شيء فتحت الليتات الحمراء وما رحت بس اشوف واحد جالس قدامي وكلها تاتوز على وجهه.
This was my expectation of you. This is what you really are.
فشفت شخص مثل هذا طريق ما بعد كلام.
You guys should be swapped. I didn't expect that.
The rocker was someone who I wouldn't expect to be, a heavy metal musician.
I should have these tattoos, not you, man.
Change.
الشاب اللي قبالي براسي كنت راسم صورة إنه هو راح يكون عربي كثير شكله.
That's how you learn.
When I saw Garrett on a wheelchair, I was completely taken aback. Hey man, come on.
لما جت العلبة فتحته ما مكتوب عليه شيء. ما مكتوب عليه كوكاكولا.
And the minute I turned around, I saw that
الليبلز أو الشعار أو المغلف أو التصميم هو بس للعلب مش للناس.
ترى واضحة. يعني المفروض ما تحكم على الواحد بالشكل.
الشخص مو بلازم يعني ننتقده بشكله لكن اول شيء نتعرف عليه عقب نقدر نقول كيف الشخص.
it changes your mind, your perspective, your heart.
So I really like that video because that's what I think. I believe labels are for cans or for products, but not for people. But too often, that's exactly what we do. We label people. We see that, well, that this person is a problem, or this person is stuck up, or this person is selfish. But oftentimes we're taking insight from someone who doesn't like them instead of actually taking the time to get to know them. So that, I mean, to me, that's just really, really important to drive home is step outside of your comfort zone. Have those courageous conversations. Be comfortable being uncomfortable. You'd be surprised if you make friends with people who don't fit into, this nice little package that we all have, how much insight that you'll have and how many commonalities that you have, I think you'll find more similarities than differences. So we know implicit bias, the communities that tend to be impacted are those marginalized, such as women, those in the LGBTQI community, certain religions, ethnic and racial minorities. The list, though, is not exhausted, as implicit bias can be based on social economic status, political affiliation, what college you attended, marital status. We know ageism is real, people in weight and body shaming and the bias that's associated with that. The reality is, though, is that we all have biases, but we may not be aware of them. And so that's why I asked you all. I'm hoping that you all went ahead and took the implicit association test, whichever one you chose to take, because I really want you to begin to gain insight into your biases. And that way you can begin to mitigate them. And I'll give you some tools to think about as we work on that. So when we think about the units of socialization, right, and we think about bias, we have to talk about ethnocentrism, which is making judgments about other societies or cultures based on our own cultural beliefs. And I see this very much taking place often in America. It's kind of like, well, European American is the dominant group, and it becomes the default group against which all others are compared. And that's problematic because people do have other cultures and customs that they've been able to retain or they bring with them as immigrants. And so you see this picture, and both women are saying the same thing in a sense, right? So the Muslim woman is saying nothing's covered but her eyes. What a cruel male dominated culture. While the American woman is saying everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male dominated culture. So we have to really, be cognizant of our cultural beliefs and begin to think about that as we prejudge people, because that's really what we're doing. So I don't want you to practice ethnocentrism. What I want you to practice is cultural relativism, which is the ideal that the values and knowledge and behavior of people should be understood within their own cultural context, right? We see no culture is superior, but we did talk about this whole hierarchy, right? And this need to kind of place people in a box and decide, who should be on top and things of that nature. But no culture really is superior. We're just different, and we're all humans. But we tend to judge others based off of our experiences, right? So I remember I lived in Europe for quite some time, and I used to go to the spa in Germany, and there was no issue with being nude. It just was not a big to do. Where in America, to me, that's very different. People are very, my perception, just very concerned about clothing, and not, making sure that we're covered and things like that. But the spa was so refreshing because all body types were walking around. No one cared. No one was staring, and it was just so refreshing. But I also think about, living in Europe too. And like in America, we kind of have this bubble around us and, we don't want people in our personal space. And right now that's fine because of COVID and we need that with social distancing. But before then, we were like that as well. But in other cultures, oftentimes when they speak with you, they get in your face and they're talking to you, and it's not disrespectful. It's just that they don't believe in that bubble or that social spacing that we have. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to learn how to interact with people and basically meet them where they are and learn to respect their cultures. And maybe we can grow from that. So when we think about biases, explicit versus implicit, right? So we know explicit, it's directly expressed, right? Implicit is indirect. With explicit, you're aware of your bias, right? With implicit, you're unaware. So that's why I want you all to take an implicit association test, completely free, offered by Harvard. And as you saw, hopefully, they have a variety. You can do it by race, you can do it by sex and career field, you can do it by sexuality, you know, things of that nature. And that will help you kind of gauge what biases you have, as well as begin to be cognitively aware and consider those before you make decisions. And that's one of the mechanisms to help you mitigate those biases. So when we make those really quick judgments, we tend to function and focus and in that realm of implicit bias. It's second nature. This is what I would say, this is what I would do. But what I ask you to do is to stop and think for a moment. Is my bias engaged in this conversation, in my perception of this person or this situation, right? So implicit bias, again, operates unconsciously. So we, you know, a example of implicit bias would be a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than on whites, or doing, you know, more income checks on women versus men. I'm sure you all are aware in Jacksonville, we didn't even have a human rights ordinance until a couple years ago. So our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQI community were not even protected when they were renting or at their places of employment. You know, they could be let go at will if their employer did not agree with their lifestyle, which is unfathomable to me. I struggled with that when I initially got here, that was even something that had not been taken care of, and you know, ensured that everyone had equitable opportunities. But the explicit bias part would be a sign in a window saying an apartment building, we don't rent to LGBTQI people. We don't rent to ethnic minorities. We don't rent to Muslims or people who practice Hindu or, you know, things of that nature. So with this slide, we see why won't they take me along, right? And we see that in-group bias, right? Just that preferential treatment is reserved for those who we consider part of our group. And again, look at who you're associating with. You know, who comes to your home? Who visits you often? Who do you, you know, or if you're not visiting, because I get that with COVID, but who are you Zooming with? Who are you just having conversation with? You know, I meet with one friend at least once a month and we do a Zoom conversation and we drink wine and we talk. And that friend doesn't look like me. That friend is not in the same field that I'm in, you know, but it's a very good friend. And just like we connected and we again have more similarities than we do differences. So when we tend to see ourselves, you know, in people that look like or hold some other similar identity, that would be the in group. And we see this issue even on the bench when we think about the judicial system. A couple years ago, the newspaper in Sarasota did a whole evaluation of judges in certain circuits in Florida. And they looked and they found that this one judge, right, could have two different defendants, but the same judge. And the two different defendants committed the exact same crime. And in Florida, they base it off a point system, you know, that includes like your education, what crime you committed, just a variety of variables. Anyway, but they found people who had they had committed the exact same crime. They had the exact same number of points. And what they found is that there was a lot of bias going on, even with the mandatory minimums, that they found that people the judge identified with in their in group, that they would go ahead and give them a lighter sentence than those who were in the out group. And that's a problem, you know, and it has implications for a lifetime, you know. So often we may give those in our group, right, the benefit of the doubt, but we don't extend that same mercy or courtesy to others. And we really need to do that. So how do we go about countering these bias? Now that we know what they are, hopefully you've taken the test, right? So I want you to be aware of the possible biases you may have and the situations and when you tend to exhibit them. So think about that. You know, when do you tend to exhibit your biases? If you have to sit back and reflect and you took the test, when are your biases on display for whatever test you took? Okay. Be aware of possible biases you may make about someone in the group that is different from your own. oh, well, they didn't go to the same university, or they didn't go to a university. So, I perceive that they're from a lower class. Their parents probably weren't married. They probably grew up in a, those type of assumptions and biases and labels that we attach to people. But consider strategies your organization can adopt to reduce those implicit bias and discrimination generally, right? So by doing these 3 training sessions, this is something that you all have committed to doing. You're saying, hey, we know that, there are issues in our society and that they're systemic. And in order to address them, first, we need to gain the knowledge of what they are, which is what we've done with our first 2. But now we need to kind of do, what are the steps? What can we do to change things? And really, everything begins with you. And then the organization. Are your policies in line with what you're trying to achieve? Do you have some hidden discriminatory, practices and policies that you're not aware of? When's the last time you had a policy audit? What are your policies, right? Interact with people who don't have the same political view, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and or religion. Again, basically get out of your bubble, begin to interact with others, right? So countering those biases, you need to recognize a response as stereotypical. So label that response as stereotypical and identify why that response may have occurred. And then consider alternate responses for use in the future to avoid the stereotypical response. Use these alternatives as unbiased replacement responses. So if I know that when I see certain religious groups, um, I'm more prone to turn the other way. Why is that? I need to kind of do some reflection and think about, why do I feel that way about that group? Was it one person that did something to me? Because it surely wasn't the whole group. Why am I responding in that manner? Okay. So an interperspective, activity was there a time when you recall feeling different from those around you for any reason, whether it be physical size, appearance, family status, being new in the community, right? How might you imagine that the experience could have impacted how you see yourself in the formation of your personality? I know as a woman and a woman of color, I've been in situations where I've been the only one, who looks like me. Particularly when I've been faculty. I've always been the only person of color in the department at whatever university I was at. Not often was I made to feel like I was different, but I was always well aware that I was different. But again, it wasn't an issue unless someone else made it an issue. But so we have to, what are the organization implications of these differences? Do you relate more, less, or differently to people you perceive as different? I work really hard to try to get to know the person for who they are and not base things off of how they look, or what about when someone tells you, something, well, you're not going to like that person, their views are this and that. You have to be cognizant of that and remember that's that person's experience, not yours. So I want to share with you the results of my implicit association test. So I did the one based on race, and I've shared with you all that I'm biracial and I grew up in a predominantly white space. But when you see this, I just want to share because maybe some of you all took some and you were rather surprised. But it tells me that my response suggests a slight automatic preference for European Americans over African Americans. In America, you are how you present. So in America, perception is I'm African American. But my implicit association test tells me that even though I'm perceived that way, and I have no issue being perceived that way, but that I still favor European Americans over African Americans. That in itself is a problem. And I have to be cognizant of that when I interact with other people who look like me, that I have a bias. And I'll tell you, I know exactly where the bias came from. Those 4 units of socialization, right? I grew up in a predominantly white space in Wisconsin. When I look at textbooks, again, European American is perceived as the default race against which all others are compared. When I look at the media, And my friend group growing up, there was only one other biracial family in the neighborhood. So they were predominantly Caucasian. And when I look at the summary of other people's results, you see that percentage of web results with each score. So most people have a moderate or automatic preference for European Americans compared to African Americans. Only 24% have a strong preference. And then when we look at a strong automatic preference for African Americans compared to European Americans, only 2% of those, and there have been millions of people who have taken these tests that can actually say they have a preference towards African Americans versus European Americans. So I want to have a conversation about empathy. And I don't know how many of you all know Brene Brown, but I love her. And this is a really short video.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So that is so powerful to me, because this is something I believe our country really needs, is empathy. It's just that we really need to be empathetic towards one another. And I think that we're struggling right now as a society, but I'm really hopeful. So this is just a quick little thing about the business case for diversity, why you want to check your biases and why you want diversity within your workplace, and why you need to be cognizant of those biases, right? Is because it helps with your climate and culture, your productivity. Studies continuously show us that, the more diversity you have in organizations, the quicker decisions are made. And you find that biases are often, mitigated because you're interacting with people who don't look like you. So I just want you guys to think about that. What does diversity look like for Yoga for Change? When you're recruiting, where are you recruiting at? And looking at doing it through a variety of outlets, because again, it's so important to have that, because if not, what we have is the bias keeps getting confirmed through those variety, those units of socialization, particularly the media. And then we end up with not only the bias, but another component is those microaggressions, right? So those are those subtle insults that may appear to be compliments, but they're hurtful to those that they're directed at, which are people typically, again, in marginalized communities. Some of the vocabulary associated with microaggressions are ambiguous. So when I talked about Pat, people, well, what are you? Human, but that was the whole point of the skit with Pat, is that Pat's sexual identity was ambiguous. you know. Those who have been in the Army know Jody. The whole point of Jody is, Jody could be male or female, right? Jody's got your girl and he's gone, or Jody's got your man and she's gone. But some of the vocabulary, right, we know is ambiguous, subtle, stereotype, marginalized, indignities, and just as implicit biases are unconscious, microaggressions are too, but the feelings of those that it's imposed upon are very real and very raw. And I'm sure many on this call have been subject to microaggressions. I know that I have. It's comparable to like 1,000 pokes from a pen each day. When people say things to me, well, you're rather articulate. I would hope so, with the level of education, or you're a compliment to your race. What does that mean? Where they may think that's supposed to be a compliment, you're a credit to your race. That's very derogatory. And that's, I would say that's actually a macro, not a micro. So some of the examples of the damage that these microaggressions do is they really underutilize the talent that you have. It impairs your retention. I'll tell you, you may be able to recruit, but the retention will not be there. And we see this in organizations. You have some universities that, and that's where I come from. So I just share that, where they really struggle with retaining a diverse cadre of faculty members because the climate is just not conducive and they've experienced so many microaggressions. But it also impacts the individual psychologically. It impacts our performance, our growth, innovation. It doesn't allow us really to do teamwork and collaborate, because if you've said these, microaggressions to me, you're probably not going to be my favorite person. But one of the things I can do is that I can try to have a conversation with you, right? So how do I mitigate that microaggression? I could pull you aside. Hey, Kathy, when you said this to me, because I never want to do it in front of other people, because I find that people get defensive, and they shut down, and then there's going to be no dialogue. And you want to have that dialogue, so you want to be able to pull the person aside at the appropriate time, recall that conversation, and say, hey, when you said this, it made me feel this way. And then be empathetic, right? Recognize that, oh my God, if that wasn't your intent, you can be apologetic, but then take that as a lesson learned and make sure that you work on not doing that again. So microaggressions are statements like, you throw like a girl. So that's saying like female traits are undesirable. How long have you lived in our country? That's like telling someone they're not American. You're a credit to your race, people of your background are unintelligent. That's so gay. You're not man or woman enough. And that, those are not, when you say these statements we see on the left, right? But the interpretation, often by those in marginalized groups, are what we see on the right. Okay. Even though in your mind, you may have not meant it that way, it is a microaggression. And that is the way it is perceived by the person who is receiving it. So a couple years ago, Harvard students had some issues on their campus about this. And they made, they did this I am to Harvard. And you see the young lady, it says, so what do you guys speak in Japan? Asian? The African-American female, you're really articulate for a Black girl. The mixed female, I don't see color. Does that mean you don't see me? Let me just let you know that is the worst statement to say. Please don't ever tell anyone that you don't see color, because what that does is that marginalizes the experiences of ethnic and racial minorities in America. And believe me, the experiences we often have are based solely on color. And then with this young man, never seen Black people do that. So I'll share, my son graduated from Episcopal High School and he was on crew. He was one of 2 African-American males out of, I think, 76 on crew. He loved it. He had a great time, never had any issues with anybody on the team or anything. But we would have other people like on the outside when he would tell them what he does, like what sport do you play? And he said, oh, I'm on crew. I didn't know Black people did that. And he got to the point where he was like, yeah, we kind of do everything just like everybody else, and it was just like, that's a microaggression. Why would you think something like that? So they tend to be very stereotypical, such as assuming a woman in medical scrubs is a nurse versus the doctor. Another one is assuming that because someone is Asian, they're great at math. I have to share this story. So I had a student when I was at UNF, phenomenal, love her, wrote a letter for grad school, and she just graduated grad school too. Anyway, from Korea. And she said that was her biggest pet peeve. She was in my racial and ethnic minority course, is that people did not understand why she was majoring in what she was majoring in. Why wasn't she over in the science, technology, engineering, or math department? She's like, I'm not good at that subject. This is really what my passion is, social scientist, right? But microaggressions can be actions or words. So that's like when someone clutches their purse, or when we saw in the video with the judge, the mom locked her car doors, when seeing, an African-American male, or homeless person. That's a microaggression, but we know that Black males have been associated with criminality for decades in America, right? So these microaggressions, they're slights, indignities, but they hurt, and they really hurt. So, this gentleman here, are you good at math too? And he said, not really. And this was in 2016, but still these stereotypes, right? Microaggressions, again, people in marginalized communities, we experience them every day. I couldn't even tell you we're gay. Like, what does that mean? I'm not even sure what that means. But again, you see that B behind them because it's like 1,000 stings, right? And they hurt, and they're hurtful, and they're subtle, but they lack, like awareness, just cognitive awareness of what you're saying, just the ideal of thinking before you speak. We've seen, like, when we do this, these implicit bias and microaggressions and making people feel like the other, the in group versus the out group. We've seen this happen, and that's how we've ended up with Japanese internment camps. That's how we've ended up with our indigenous population on depleted land. I mean, it can be detrimental. This is when we saw, the military was segregated, we're a nation of immigrants, and I think sometimes the perception in the climate is anti-immigrant, as we see certain rhetoric about certain immigrant groups. It's surprising, but it's hurtful, to many first and second generation, as well as the immigrant groups, the ones who are new here. Again, we're a nation of immigrants, but unless you're indigenous, but otherness, we know, has led to oppression, right? So it's one of the ways that slavery's been justified: eugenics, Jim Crow, homophobia, Islamophobia. And history has shown us what happens when we begin to speak about others as if they're not human, right? And again, that's where we've seen, things come in where, people are pushed into certain areas, redlining, housing covenants. We talked about that because the perception was that if African Americans, even one, moves into your area, property values go down. I hope this isn't a surprise, but that stereotype is very much still out there and is alive and well. So that ideal is still out there. It's a problem. It's not true, but it's so ingrained into our, I guess, psyche oftentimes that people believe it. So what are some things you can do, like if you've seen someone commit a microaggression, right? Remember the conversation. Manage your feelings of defensiveness. Be open to hearing the difficult feedback if you're the one who's committed the microaggression and you've been called out about it. Again, I would always recommend pulling someone aside and having that conversation. I would never confront someone, I mean, unless they were like over the top with their microaggressions. And then it may be more macro than micro. But other than that, if you're the recipient, and you're hearing this feedback that you've committed this offense, be open and be willing to learn from it. We all make mistakes, but we can't grow and do better until we know better. Listen intently to what happened, reflect on what you heard, you know, take responsibility if you've made that mistake. And don't try to prove your view. Too often, that's what I see happen. People say, well, no, what I meant was, or no, what I said was, and it's just like, just own up. We're all adults. We all make mistakes. Um, Share how you can make it different if possible, and follow up, you know, um, ask the person, after, well, do you understand why, I had that conversation with you? How did you feel about it? And just follow up with them and let them know, I'm not trying to shut you down, but I just wanted to make you aware of this because I don't know that you were aware. And the way the person, the microaggression you committed, the way that person could perceive your statement is like this, and I didn't want you to make that mistake or to do that, unconsciously. So I've learned that people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. And I think that's very important when we think about implicit bias and microaggressions is how do you make people feel? Are people, do they feel that they're able to come back and be transparent with you and share, that you made them uncomfortable or the statement that you made, the way they perceived it to be? Are you, when you experience or when you see microaggressions take place, are you actively, being engaged, or are you just standing there being a passive bystander? Are you going to say something? Are you going to be an ally when you see something take place that is not right? And those are things that you really need to begin to think about. And what mechanisms, begin to play in your head. Well, if this happens, this is what I would do. When I was a diversity officer, I would talk with my students, especially at a time where I perceived a lot of Islamophobia was taking place. And so I trained my students basically. I was like, so let me tell you, so if you see a Muslim woman surrounded, I would tell my female students this, by a group or something like this, what would you do? You know, and they, I don't know. And I know exactly what I do. I'd walk right through that group and I'd be like, Lisa, where have you been? We've been waiting on you. I don't know her, of course, but the group doesn't, they don't know that I don't know her. But I bet you she's going to go with me because I'm actively trying to protect her and get her out of that situation. And that's the whole point is you have to be cognizant and you want to be actively engaged, but you can't do that unless you learn how to check your own biases and understand if you're committing microaggressions and begin to work to correct those deficits. And we all have deficits. But again, we can't do better until we know better. So I would love to have some dialogue with you all. Did you guys, everybody get a chance to take the test? Was anybody surprised by the test? Disappointed? I was disappointed with yeah, me too, right? I know. Because we're like, oh no, I'm woke, right? No. Just because those units of socialization impact us all. That's why I shared mine. That was my vulnerability base with you all, to share that with you, because I want you to, we all have them. We all have biases. And it's a shame, right? I love the skin I'm in, but I still recognize that I have a bias just slightly towards European Americans. So what about some dialogue?
While it's recent, can you just explain that example you gave a little bit more with walking into a crowd to like disrupt the crowd around a Muslim woman?
Oh, yes. So the reason I said that is because then I'm active, right? I'm an active bystander. I'm trying to get her out of that situation. That's why. So like say they're around her and they're harassing her because she has on a hijab or something like that. And at a time, and it was to me, my perception, we were very, experienced a lot of Islamophobia in our country at that point. And I wanted my female students to know how to assist a female Muslim, woman, and so that was the point of it, is kind of go in there like, hey, where have you been? Come on, I've been waiting on you. The rest of the group is over there too, and just proceed to walk her right out. And she'll go with you because she knows, what's taking place. But that's like women though, right? When we go to the club together, if we go together, we're coming back home together. I'm not leaving you, right? I mean, you have to think about that bystander component too, right? Some guy's trying to get you to go with him or whatever, and we've come together, we're going home together. So I'm going to walk you right out of that situation as well. And our men, right, as allies, same thing. If you see a situation where, maybe a female's had too much to drink and you see somebody preying on her, please engage, hey, I've been waiting on you, some kind of conversation to kind of get her out of that situation, and then hopefully find her friend's cell phone, something so that you can, help her safely make it home. Was that good, Kelsey? Kelsey, that's great. Okay, good. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
I've heard of like bystander intervention trainings. Do you have any that you know of that you recommend?
I'll do some research, but yeah, I like them. With my students, we did, one that I had found for universities, and it was based on sexual assault was one of the ones I did, because I also did Title IX. And so I had done the training with them, and we did a video about it and everything. So I'll look for some for you guys, and I'll definitely share those. Yeah.
And I think that's where it originally came out of, sexual assault, but I have seen them recommended as an actionable item, thing to do regarding anti-racism work. So I've been interested in that.
Yeah, because I mean, you can, right, as an ally, but you got to make sure you stay safe too. So, initially, because especially to me with racial incidents, oftentimes it is, it can be very violent, so you want to call the police first and foremost, but, and get assistance, but then to try to, de-escalate the situation some kind of way. So I'll find some resources for you guys, and then you guys can kind of, look at that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? So did you guys take the implicit association test? Everyone who I can see, would you shake your head yes or no? You did? Okay. No, you got to go back and take it. Those who didn't, you got to go take it, because you'll be surprised, and there's a list, and you could just pick from the list. And what's good about it though is it only collects aggregate data, so it doesn't ask for your name or anything like that. And so people like me will go in and get the data set to use it for training or something, but it doesn't, your identity is totally anonymous. So. Yes.
So thank you for this presentation. It was really wonderful. And I love the way you broke down all the different concepts and definitions on microaggressions and what that looks like. So for me, in the implicit bias test, I took it a couple of years ago. I might take it again to see if it still holds true. But my bias did surprise me. I'm bicultural, but grew up mostly in a European kind of context. And my bias was that I favored African American over European, which surprised me. And I wonder if there's another way to measure, or I don't know, think more introspectively about why that is, because my socialization, for me, at least I would think that it would have gone the other way. And I wonder if that bias is coming out of a place of, I don't know, empathy or sympathy, or I don't want to say pity necessarily, but if it's coming from this other space of, oh, identify with your challenges or your struggles or whatever you might be going through as a person of color. So I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. And you saw the low percentage of people who favor, right, African Americans over. So you're one of those low low percentage of people over here. And I wonder too if it comes from a place of empathy, because with socialization, I mean, again, we know, European Americans, again, that's just, the default race in America that we're all kind of socialized to. Nothing good, bad, or indifferent about it. It's just the reality of the majority. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what your test would look like now too.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll definitely go back and do a kind of a cross-reference point to see where I'm at now, because I don't know, it may be like, the more I'm thinking about it, I think it may have come from a place of empathy, because I didn't grow up in the US. I was born in the Middle East, and my dad, I mean, he's like the only Black man in, I don't know, however mile radius. And he went through a lot of just explicit outward racist remarks towards him, where he would be called cockroach and just all different types of things. So I could be where it's stemming from, for sure.
Yeah, and see, yeah, and we're kind of opposite. So I grew up, right, I'm biracial, and we grew up in a predominantly white space in Wisconsin. But my issue was my mother would be called an N lover, because we were, you know what I'm saying? Because we were one of two biracial families. And I just remember like conversations you would hear, and I'm just like, really? So yeah, I get it. But I would be interested too. And then remember too, it's based off of speed. So were you giving it thought before you took it, or were you doing it really based on speed like it should be? Because if you think about it, you're going to answer it how you think you want to answer. But if you do it based off speed, that's where that unconscious, that bias comes in, and you're going to automatically respond the way you truly do see.
Right. It was definitely based on speed. I remember that. I would just click, 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 go through. So yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, Anne.
Hello. I took several of the tests, and I thought it was interesting. I would encourage you to take more than one if you go and take them, because I expected in taking the one based on race that I would, having grown up not completely in this country, but most of the time from age 6 up, I lived in this country and mostly in the South. And I think, all the things that were fed in the media, I would have expected to have the preference for Europeans versus African Americans, and I had neither. So that surprised me. But then there's another test, and it has to do with associations. And it is, I think, Blacks and weapons, and whites and, I want to say like garden tools or something like that, something violent. And I did show that association with Blacks and weapons in that test. And I was like, okay, there it is. That makes sense to me that it's showing up. It just didn't show up in the preference, but it showed up in the association piece. And then I was really surprised and annoyed that I had more associations for women and household, like women in the home and men in careers. But that showed up too. And I was like, what?
Yeah, I do too.
It's interesting. There's so many of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do too. With the women one. Now the one about the weapons, yeah, but see how the media, you know what I'm saying? And that criminalization, right, of Black and brown bodies. So I always find it interesting that we're only 5% of the world's population, but we imprison 25% of the world's population. You look at the prison, 1 in 3 African American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system at some point in their life. We know that there are 2 million men locked up now. Out of that 2 million, over 1 million of them are Black and brown. And out of that 1 million, more than half of them are in there for non-violent drug offenses. So I mean, there's just so much to unpack. And to me, though, the system is kind of working the way it's supposed to. I don't know how many of you all know, but like vagrancy wasn't against the law until slavery was outlawed. And that was the way to justify picking up Black men and doing the convict leasing system to businesses because they couldn't afford the bail. So I mean, I think it's very much ingrained and embedded in our system, but we need to begin to deconstruct those issues and look at how, they continue to negatively impact certain groups and this vicious cycle of inequality that we see continue to be reproduced. Bethany?
Hi.
Hello.
How are you, Dr. Hodo? Thank you so much for everything. This is amazing. I wanted to say, when I took the implicit bias test too, I had this really interesting, I took a whole bunch of them, but I had the normal one where I favor European Americans, but then I had this really, because I grew up next to a boys' school, but I grew up in like a really rural white area of Maine, and I live right next to this extremely exclusive boys' school. So it was like mostly high wealth, privileged white guys, and they were only, it's a one-year school, so they were only one age. They were only 18 or 19 years old, and we were like relentlessly bullied by those guys, me and my sister, even though we were all white. But because like our post office was over here, we had to cross the whole campus to go get our mail and come back. But I grew up, I was there from like the age of 6 to the age of 19. And so I had this really strong bias against feeling how violent that age group of white men was. I had a strong like a bias against that group, like frat boy type.
Mm-hmm. But see, now that you know that, right? So when you interact with people in that group, you have that bias. So now before you react or respond or engage, you need to reflect, right? Because that's the only way you're going to mitigate it. So am I acting, and with my bias, or have I checked my bias?
Right.
And I'm, recognizing that when I interact, because like you could see like the guy with the khaki pants on with a sweater tied around, that's what I would think of preppy.
Yeah.
And then maybe make that assumption, so now you're aware of it. So that's good.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then Shiva am I saying it right? Shiva, where are you at? Where'd you go?
Yes.
Okay. She said, and you're right, internalized racism is real. So, oftentimes people are told, to be whatever race they are, ethnicity is not a good thing, to marry outside of their race, so I mean, everything you're saying is definitely true. Her comment was internalized racism is real. She was told, in so many words, to stay away from Black boys. And that is very much that is a reality. And I will tell you, out of my siblings, the 3 biracial ones that my parents had together, I'm the only one married to an African American. So, but we were brought up in a predominantly white space. So I'm the only, but it's funny because my mom shows favoritism towards my son because he's the only one who looks like her kids. So it works good for him, I mean, I'm just being honest. Don't tell her if you ever meet her though. But yeah, she does. I mean, it's so damn obvious to me. I'm just like, wow, but she's like, oh, yeah, but so it is real. And internalized racism for people, I mean, we feel it, if you're constantly told you're not worthy, your people are no good, your group is this, you begin to believe and buy into that, and that can be so debilitating. And it's just, but I'm glad that you know better but it is very much real.
This, the implicit bias test for me brought up something that I had to actually reflect on. And is it okay if I share?
Please.
Yeah. So I wonder if I am aware, I'm aware now of my implicit bias because I took the test, right? But I'm wondering if that can be felt by like our students, right? Like, do you potentially watch certain student groups in your class over other student groups based on the color of their skin or the way they present themselves? Like, are you more critical of their postures or the way that they're behaving? Do you let people interrupt you or speak out of turn? Do you correct, cross talking more with one group of people than the other? So this is sort of like where I want to bring this now to the next level, right? Because I talked to Dr. Hodo about the training, and this was not the basic level training, right? Like, we talked about some pretty topics that got people a little bit elevated and maybe energized, right? Like, we shook the tree a little bit, right? Like, we want to make sure we all are able to look at ourselves. So something that I'm realizing is, do I call on certain students more or less than because of how they're presenting or the stories I'm creating, So that's kind of like the nugget I want you guys to just think, right? You don't have to answer, obviously, but just notice that the next time you teach, because the next time I teach, I'm going to wonder if I'm moderately automatic preference for African American compared to European American.
And I mean, yeah, and I mean, think about what you just said and think about what I shared about the schools, right? We know teachers are not in this for the money. I mean, they can't be, right? They're making like 39,000. And I know that they come in with the best intentions, but that bias is what we see with that school to prison pipeline. And studies have shown where, you know, you have two kids, one with, and it would just be a European sounding name and a name that would sound African American. Both students commit the same offense. And initially the teacher would just say, okay, you know, and just chalk it up to bad behavior that day. But then a couple days later, they both would do the same thing. But studies have shown that the child with the African-American sounding name, the teacher began to see that as a pattern versus with the Caucasian student, she didn't see it that way. So I know teachers do not, you know, go into this with the intent, you know, of harming people, but we have to be cognizant, right? You know, I have to be aware too when I was in the classroom, like, am I calling on people of color more than other ones, especially when I'm talking about issues surrounding race, because I want everybody engaged in that conversation, not just certain people. So yeah, I love that. You guys, please think about that. Like when you're teaching next time, are you engaging with certain students more often? Are you correcting other students more often? The cross-talking, you know, things like that. Today, it just irked the hell out of me. Somebody's phone was ringing in yoga. You know, and I was just like, I mean, you know, and I was impressed with my instructor though, that she didn't say anything, because I don't know that I could have been that person, but you know, but yeah, but I mean, just something for you to think about how you're interacting with the different people that you're servicing. And remember, I mean, you know, you're doing something I hope that you love and that you want that to be shown through what you do. So if there are no other questions, we're at 6:55, but I just wanted to make sure, because to me, this is like, you know, the wrap up, you know, and I wanted to make sure that we, you know, covered everything and that we were good to go. Oh, okay. Really resonate with me. Ah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Kelsey. Uh-huh. Being expelled for having, yeah, like an anger outburst. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder about that too at a Christian school. I told you my son went to Episcopal. In his graduating class, there were 9 African Americans out of 150. And so, but they knew what I did, so and I would be at the school. So, you know, so I think that might have, you know, if there was any implicit bias there, I think they all knew that I would definitely come up and point that out. But yeah, I wonder too about that client. Well, I wish you all a good evening. I'm gonna go eat now.
Just want to say, go Bucks.
Oh yes, yes, Forrest, you're my buddy. You're my buddy, and he's got his hat on. I love it. Go Bucks! I'm with you. Thank you all so much. I'll send out the survey. Thank you. I'll send out the survey link probably tomorrow, or the next day at the latest. Okay, and then I'll make sure you guys get that. And then I'll also look though for some bystander intervention opportunities for you all as well. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.